Graham in Indiana. Hey, Graham, how's it going?
Hey, how are you doing?
Doing just fine. How about yourself?
Doing pretty good.
Cool.
It's funny, I heard you mention already on the podcast Peter Singer and altruism. So I wanted to bring up a couple of things that I heard on Cosmic Skeptic's podcast. And you, specifically your discussion about the psychological egoism versus Singer's utilitarianism.
Yeah.
So Dan, feel free to comment if you have any.
Hell yeah, go for it. I enjoyed this stuff. See, Alex brings the content to me right here, so I don't have to work for it.
Yeah. On the Cosmic Skeptic podcast, available on iTunes and YouTube and Spotify. Then once the number 2 philosophy podcast in the UK. That's the one you mean? Yeah.
Hey man, I got my iTunes email the other day. I believe Truth Wanted is number 1432 on religion and spirituality in the United States. So we're getting there. Okay.
Hey man, the US store is a whole different ball game.
Yeah,
it's a whole different ball game. Who knows where I'm at over there?
Yeah. Anyway, what did you want to ask specifically, Graham?
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify a few things. That it seemed, Alex, that you were espousing the view of not a normative egoism, but a descriptive psychological egoism. Is that true? So it's not a prescription, but a description.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And at the same time, you seemed on the podcast to, I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but you seem to be making the case that it was somewhat compatible with Singer's utilitarianism.
So it's not, it's not compatible with Singer's specific utilitarianism, but I think it is compatible with utilitarianism in general, right? But it kind of depends on how you do it. So this is something I really needed to clarify, and I was mainly trying to phrase my views here in a way to challenge Singer rather than to explain my own views. So this is a good opportunity. The utilitarian, depending on how they do it, so they'll say something like, we know that pleasure is desired, and therefore we think it's desirable. So someone like Singer says, everybody recognizes that pleasure is desired. Our intuitions tell us that pleasure is something that is desired, and if pleasure is desired, then the utilitarian makes the jump to say it's desirable, like it should be desired. Right. But the important jump here is the jump of how you get from saying, well, I only ever experience my own pleasure, so I think my pleasure is a good thing. That's something that I can't help but feel. But if I think that my pleasure is a good thing, why should I think that everybody's pleasure is a good thing for everybody? So Singer makes that jump by saying, well, I think pleasure is good. And if pleasure is good, it must be good for everybody. It can't be better for me than it is for the next person. And I'm simply turning around and saying, well, Mr. Singer, you're not experiencing pleasure as good. You're experiencing your pleasure as good. That's the thing you're actually experiencing. So I don't necessarily agree with Singer that you can make the jump from saying pleasure is desired to it should be desired. That should be the basis of your thought. But since Singer makes that jump, since the way that Singer is justifying it is by saying that because I desire pleasure, I think pleasure is desirable, I'm saying, well, okay, I'll grant you that basis. Let's say that because we desire pleasure, it's therefore desirable. Technically, you don't desire pleasure, you desire your own pleasure, if you see what I'm saying. So that was the point I was trying to make. The utilitarian has to, or at least the classical utilitarian has to believe, separate from the normative case, they have to believe the psychological case, that the only thing that can be desired in itself is pleasure. Mill devotes an entire chapter to it. It's like desire is based on pleasure, and pleasure is the only desired thing in itself. I'm not talking about the prescriptive bit yet, just talking about the psychological bit. And so for me, it seems quite clear that it's not pleasure that's desired, it's your pleasure that's desired by you, and there's no reason to make that jump to someone else. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so I'm agreeing here, and it seems Singer is definitely violating Hume's law here of you can't derive an ought from an is.
Yeah. That's what I would accuse. I mean, that's the kind of famous criticism of the utilitarian. That's the point that someone like that G.E. Moore would make when Mill first presented utilitarianism, and Moore actually says the error here is so obvious that it's astonishing that Mill failed to notice it. And Well, maybe the answer to that is that Mill did notice it, because the utilitarian isn't necessarily making the jump from is to ought. They're just saying, it's kind of like, so in the same way that Hume writes that you can't get an ought from an is, he's also responsible for the problem of induction, or he wrote about the problem of induction. So what he means by that is in a way you can't get a will be from an is. But Hume kind of writes that, yeah, technically you can't say that because something is the case, it will be the case, or you can't say because the sun has risen, it will rise tomorrow. We kind of make that jump anyway. Why do we make that jump? It's just kind of intuitive. And so, yeah, we can't get an ought from an is, but we kind of make that jump intuitively. So maybe Hume's point there isn't to say you cannot get an ought from an is. It's just to say that you can't technically get an ought from an is, but we do it anyway. So the utilitarian is on firm ground to say, to make that jump. I think that's not the interesting criticism. The interesting criticism to me is like, let's just grant them. Let's just jump that gap and say, okay, so pleasure is desirable. It should be desired. Why should I desire someone else's pleasure? Why should I desire maximal pleasure for everyone more than my own pleasure? And my case was to say, I can care about someone else's pleasure as a derivative of my pleasure. I can say, I want you to have a pleasurable experience because my knowledge that you're in pleasure will bring me pleasure. Singer says, no, it's not that. It's that your pleasurable experience is good. Full stop. That's it. I'm saying, no, your pleasurable experience brings me pleasure and I experience my pleasure as good. I take that extra step to try and avoid as much of the is ought jump as I can.
Sure.
I don't know if that's something you agree with or not.
So there's so you've essentially said something here that was very similar to what you said towards the beginning of that conversation, and so I would say the way that we use the word good has several different like semantic meanings, and I would argue that we often use the word good actually to describe something that is pleasurable. And so this is not to say that we should do what is good, but it is to say that we have a certain meaning of the word good that actually means pleasurable in some sense. And we actually have a definition of the word bad that means painful in some sense. So
yeah, but we've got to be careful there, because then we're committing the naturalistic fallacy, which is another thing so the big criticism that Moore made of Mill was this idea that, look, you can't define good. The one thing you can't do in ethics is define what good is. This was Moore's view. He says you could say that pleasure is good in the sense that pleasure is an example of something that is good, but you can't say pleasure is good by definition. You can't say that's what good is. That's what it means. Moore thought that good was like yellow, his famous comparison. He says, look, I can't define yellow. I can define it in terms of like a certain electromagnetic vibration or anything, but that's not what yellow is. That's not what the experience of yellow is. I can't explain what it is. I can't write it down. I can't define it. But we all know what yellow is. Like, we all know it when we see it. That's how we learn what it is. When something is yellow and we point it out and say that's yellow, like, when I say a lemon is yellow, I don't mean yellow is by definition a lemon. I just mean a lemon is an example of something. And he thought in the same way we learn what good is by kind of pointing to examples of it. So Mill is able to say, if he wants to, that everything that's good is also pleasurable. That's fine. But he can't say that good means pleasure. That's the criticism that Moore made. So what you're saying there about good being defined as pleasure, I think that's a mistake, because it's like a philosophical jump you can't make. But what you can do is what I do, which is to say that everything that we experience as good happens to be pleasurable. Doesn't mean that's what it is by definition, but it just means that you can kind of treat them as synonymous,
Yeah. Well, so I would argue that I think we can make a claim about something that is good without it being necessarily a normative claim. So I could say, pleasure is good without saying, and therefore we should pursue what is pleasurable. People often use good in a very abstract philosophical sense, but I think there's also a very concrete meaning that sometimes we have associated with the word good. And so I say pleasure is good, and therefore, if you value what's good, then you should pursue pleasure.
Well, that's still a problem, because the kind of if then doesn't actually follow logically. I mean, you can formalize the argument. People think that you can avoid the is ought jump by saying, well, if you add the premise, if I want X, then I should do X. It's like that doesn't actually logically that doesn't actually logically follow. But what was it you just said about a good? Just before that, you said something else.
So we typically have like a very abstract view of what.
I remember this. So sorry, it is 2:10 in the morning here. When I made
surprisingly, you're very coherent at this time. I just want to applaud you again for doing that.
I'm often more coherent in the early hours than I am in the daytime. The first video I made comprehensively on morality back in my embarrassingly non-cognitive days was a video that essentially.
Hold on, wait a minute. That's such a pretentious way to say stupid. I'm just going to put that out there right now.
No. I mean, okay, don't misinterpret me. I mean, I was an ethical non-cognitivist. I mean, that was my view.
Okay.
I thought I was a.
All right. I thought you were just saying, back when I was, just not as intellectually sound as I am today. Like, all right, man, like you didn't read the books.
I'm only ever necessarily pretentious. Never, it never happens when it doesn't have to.
Necessarily
but pretentious. I made this video essentially trying to make this point in saying, and it's an interesting thing that I hadn't really thought about before. So I made this video saying, look, let's say that something's good. Sure, let's say that we figure out what's good and what's bad. But as you point out, that's just descriptive. It's like saying it's yellow, right? It's like this chair is yellow. So what? This thing is good. So what? Does that mean? Right. And the question then just becomes, well, why should I do what's good? So ethics, to me, isn't. If ethics is about prescription, which I think it should be, that's a that. I shouldn't phrase it like that. I shouldn't phrase it like that. Which I think it is. Which I think is what most people think it is. Right. Then ethics can't purely be about what's good and bad. It has to be instead about what you should and shouldn't do. Right. So to me, defining good and defining bad isn't the interesting part of ethics. The interesting part is what is prescription? What does it mean to say you should do something? Don't define good. Define should. What does should mean? And to me, I've tried to define should in a purely descriptive way so that we can talk about ethics in a descriptive way, which is something I'm kind of developing at the moment in my thought process and discussing. But I think it can be done. But that's the important thing, the take home for people to really latch onto, I think, is what you just said, that just because something's good doesn't mean you should do it. Unless you define good as good just means what you should do. But then again, you're committing a fallacy. How can you define good? If I just define yellow as what you should do, like, what's your justification for that? Where's that coming from? It's just plucked out of thin air, It's crossing the is ought divide, as you say.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, Graham, hopefully that answers some of your questions. You got to have a little bit of back and forth there, which is really good. What'd you think?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Awesome.
It's one of the better reactions I've had.
Yeah, for sure.
And thank you for listening to the podcast as well. I'm glad that people actually sit through the damn things. I do wonder if people actually can be bothered to sit for 2 hours and listen to two guys talk about meta ethics. So I'm glad that someone's listening.
I feel that. Well, yeah, thanks again, Graham, for calling in. Really appreciate the call, and I hope to get more calls from you in the future.
Sure. Yes.
Cool. Sounds good. We'll catch you later. So I just want to know, what's good, man? Get it?
The age-old question, yeah.
What's good? What's good, brother?
That's how I should have started my podcast with Singer.
And what should mean? And should it mean what it should? Or should
Actually, I think I nearly titled one of my videos "What's Good." I remember how that thought crossing my mind. Like, I think maybe on one of my Patreon posts or something, the title was like "What's Good, people." No, really. Yeah, it's so funny. It's so clever and wicked.
So funny, dude. That's why I made the joke. If I'm making the joke, then you know it's funny. That's how I'm defining how things are funny. If I'm making the joke.
Yeah.
Okay. So
it's like it's the kind of joke. It's like when you talk about free will, and then someone says, I don't know, I don't really get it, and someone says, but you've got no choice, and
right.
very great joke, mate. Yeah, well done. Never heard that before.
Yeah, real good. What great careers and lives we choose to live. We get to hear that all the time.
We have so much fun. We have so much fun.
It's so good.